Welcome to Vantage Point Podcast, a podcast brought to you by NWR Communications and 92 Studio. This podcast is intended for education and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. G'day and welcome to Vantage Point, a podcast where we like to get behind the people who are running businesses predominantly listed on the ASX. And we're privileged today to have Steve Wedan, the company's CEO and founder of Imricor, a Minnesota-based medical technology company. So it's nice warm weather here in Melbourne today compared to the snow that you've come from. But thanks very much for being with us today, Steve.
It's my pleasure. It's always a good time to leave Minnesota and come to Melbourne.
No, it's a good time to have the Spring Racing Carnival as well, which you obviously didn't get to because you're working. Before we get started into the sort of nitty-gritty, perhaps you could just sort of give us a bit of a background on Imricor, on the industries and how long it's sort of been around for and why you founded the company.
Sure. So it's a long story. It goes back to 95 when they first started trying to do or think about doing these types of procedures guided by MRI. But it's important to understand what these kinds of procedures are. So just a little bit about cardiac ablation. This is, so when your heart beats, it's because an electrical wave is flushed through the heart and that makes the muscle contract. And if that electrical wave that flushes through the heart is disrupted in some way, if if there's a spontaneously firing area or if there's some area where the substrate has been destroyed or is altered in some way, that creates these things called arrhythmias, atrial fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia, atrial flutter. It's when your heart's not beating properly. And what they do for that, and they do it quite a bit, it seems like a niche thing, but it's an $8 billion US market worldwide for something called catheter ablation. And that's where they'll put a catheter into your leg, advance it into your heart, and selectively burn the heart tissue in a way that restores that normal heart rhythm. In particular, if something's misfiring, they'll either isolate it or just destroy that area. If there's an area where the wave doesn't pass through properly, they'll just burn that and destroy that area as well, and everything just goes back to normal. That is a procedure they've been doing for a long time, but they recognized back in the mid-90s that we're kind of coming up on the limit of what we can do with the way that procedure is guided. Because what you're doing is when you're bringing that catheter in the heart, you're using X-ray fluoroscopy to see the catheter inside the patient. You can see the spine, you can see ribs and so forth, but you can't actually see the heart that you're working on.
Which is kind of critical.
It is. It's an important step. So they've used electrical activity and different measurements that they can take to try to determine where it is they need to burn. The idea was if we could just do it with MRI, the heart's clearly visible. And you could see exactly where you need to go, get directly to work without having to hunt around. And then, importantly, when you make those burns and you zap those little areas, you can go back and check your work. So a lot of times today when you make a burn, the patient goes home, that burn can heal. It looks like you did the right job during the procedure. The patient goes home and it heals, and then the arrhythmia comes right back again, which is why so many patients who get these ablation procedures have to come in for a second and third procedure.
What's the procedure where it has the sort of valve or the clip? What's that called?
There's a mitral valve.
Mitral valve, yeah. Is that sort of similar sort of procedure or different?
That's a little different because that's structural heart.
Yeah.
And this is electrophysiology. So it's actually completely different doctors that do those two things, which is remarkable because they're both trying to help you from your heart disease. But these are a lot of times electric-minded cardiologists who then focus on the electrical activity of the heart. That's the people who do our procedures. But remarkably, what we're doing is sort of changing that narrative as we show them where to go so they don't have to use the electrical activity to find where they should ablate. It makes it a simpler procedure, a more anatomical procedure where you just see the heart and you go to that location and burn.
No, that makes perfect sense. So in terms of obviously coming up with that's the problem, and it's been hasn't sort of really evolved in a long time until your invention. Can you sort of just explain where you're at with a couple of products that you've got already commercialized and proven, and B with VT, and just sort of give a breakdown on how first path forward helps VT and familiarity with that and the labs and the cardiologists and whatnot, and why that's so important?
Sure. So it's important to understand that we're not making a new procedure, right? That the devices we make are just like the devices that the doctors already use today in that X-ray lab. The only thing that's different about ours is they're MR compatible, but they're the only MR compatible catheters in the whole world. So no one else has been able to do this. So as we advance through the approvals, you always start with, of the three main ablation procedures you do, atrial flutter, atrial fibrillation, and ventricular tachycardia. Those are sort of from easiest to hardest. We always start with atrial flutter, right, to get your devices on the market. And that's what we've done in Europe. And that was, it was a great success. We did a clinical trial. It had 100% chronic effectiveness for our devices. I don't know of another trial that did that in this space. And we've been commercial. Unfortunately, we commercialized right before COVID and that put us on hold for a while. But we also knew that over those several years following the release of atrial flutter, that we were going to have to develop a couple of additional tools that let you go from one side of the heart to the other side of the heart. And in making those tools, we knew it was going to be a couple of years. So through the pandemic, we just kept doing it. And now, at the end of it, we are ready to go to those complex ablation procedures that are over here and not over here. And ventricular tachycardia, the hardest one, is the one we're going for next because it's the hardest, and MR adds so much value, we believe, to that particular procedure.
So can you talk to us about how they're sort of completing that at the moment and the difference between atrial fibrillation with regards to procedure numbers and the sort of market there? How does that sort of look?
Yeah, so atrial fibrillation is by far the most common arrhythmia, but ventricular tachycardia is it's making a surge because people are living today with defibrillators and other medical technology that exists longer than they were living 20 years ago. And as they age with these same conditions that cause ventricular tachycardia, it starts to pop up. So we're finding now that it's a growing patient need, and it's really a tough procedure to do conventionally. And MR is just perfect for it. And to give you an idea what I'm talking about, so the ventricle is this one chamber at the bottom of your heart, and they'll have to take a measurement, voltage measurements around the whole inside to try to find areas where it's not quite dead, but it's a little bit dead, and it's between two dead spots because that's a channel that the electrical wave kind of gets stuck in, and it makes the whole heart just beat super fast. And it takes a long time to do that. Sometimes 2, 3, 4, 6 hours. It can take a long time. And you burn one of those little areas, those channels, and another one pops up, and it's just a nightmare. So what we do is we just image the heart, and about 5 minutes later, you've got an image where we just point out, here's where those channels are. Go there and burn. You can re-image again, see if new channels have popped up, and get done quickly. So we think we have the potential of taking the hardest, most time-consuming and costly procedure and making one of the easiest and simple ones.
Because it almost sounds like a bit of a guessing game at the moment.
It's
or a long.
I wouldn't call it a guessing game, but it is definitely imperfect.
Yeah,
that's for sure. And it's there's a big need there. I mean, about half of them are effective when you do this. That's
the 50% effectiveness, right?
Yeah,
which isn't great.
Not great.
No.
Even for atrial fibrillation, those are always effective. Not always. They're about 80% effective the first time you do it for a while.
Yeah.
And then when it heals, those are the patients that are often coming back for a second or third procedure.
And in terms of the North Star mapping, can you sort of talk to how that came about and what is it, and how that sort of helps the company progress as well?
So if we look at, we've got MR and conventional is X-ray. So because X-ray is, you really can't see anything, they've developed over the years these things called 3D electroanatomical mapping systems. That's where from the outside of the patient, they're tracking the catheter inside, and they try to superimpose those things on another computer screen. So essentially you take a catheter and in sort of free space, you move the catheter around and slowly build a geometry that represents that chamber of the heart. And when you have that geometry, then you'll map electrical activity onto that geometry, and that's called electroanatomical mapping. And that's what they use today. So in the MR, we also provide electroanatomical mapping, but we don't run around with a catheter inside that's tracked by things on the outside of the body. We track our catheter with the MRI, so everything's automatically calibrated and registered, and we image the patient, and we make those shells from the real pictures, the real 3D anatomy of that patient. So image, put your catheter in, and go to work. But we can still, and need to, map that electrical activity onto those shells and give doctors the same tools, same environment that they're used to today. But our North Star 3D mapping system is the only mapping system in the world that connects natively to an MRI. No one else can do that, and that makes it's a really valuable thing.
And in terms of sort of path forward on North Star, is there any sort of licensing opportunities there, or what's the sort of path forward there?
Yeah. So first, it's important to say that what we're doing is ablation, but our platform technology is really for any intervention that you want to do guided by MRI. Anytime a doctor says, hey, if I could see what I was doing with this patient inside that patient's body, I could do a better job. And that goes across different field strengths of MR and complex ablations, simple little guide wire interventions. And for every company that's got one of those little guide wire interventions, for instance, they also need a mapping system or some sort of guidance system, and Northstar fits that bill. So we are looking actually currently at some licensing opportunities for Northstar.
Yeah, nice. And just in terms of these different procedures and whatnot, and particularly in MRI setting, what's the sort of practical nature of a hospital starting it up? They obviously require some CapEx spend and a lab. Can you just talk us through that and how that looks?
Yeah, it's a big change, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a big ship, and I always say it takes a little time, right, to turn a big ship. But then once it's turning, there's no turning back, and it's in that turn that we're at now. It's starting to gain that momentum again, kind of the momentum we lost actually
with COVID. Yeah.
But it requires that you have a couple of EP labs, the electrophysiology labs with X-ray fluoroscopy, and you either replace one of them or make a new lab that just replaced the X-ray with an MRI.
Yeah.
And we call that an ICMR lab just to differentiate it. That takes some time, but then once that lab is built, there's no competition in that lab for us. Every procedure that's done in there has to have devices that are MR compatible, and only Imricor makes the MR compatible devices. If you go to an X-ray lab, you can mix and match catheters and things from all sorts of manufacturers. Not the case in the ICMR lab.
And within the ICMR lab, what's the sort of value proposition to hospitals? Can they do more procedures? Obviously, there's the benefit of being able to really see what you're doing. But is there a sort of ROI, or how does that? Obviously, there's better patient quality outcomes.
It's a great question, and a lot of people say, okay, but MR is super expensive, gold-plated modality, but it's not really. It's more expensive than X-ray fluoroscopy, but not as much as people think. But once you have that MRI lab established, it can do more and generate more revenue for the hospital than an X-ray lab can. An X-ray lab, when you're not doing a procedure, it's really not good for anything else. You shut the lights out, close the door. But an MRI, or ICMR lab as we call them, it still has a standard diagnostic MRI system in it. So when you're not doing a procedure, you can be scanning, and it doesn't have to be the heart. It can be knees, brains, spines, whatever, and generating revenue in that footprint for the hospital. So from the hospital standpoint, that's a much more valuable floor space than
just
the
a
EP lab
specific
that's right next door.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to me, it sounds like the mission or the vision of the company hasn't changed since its inception. How do you sort of look at that from 95 to 2023, almost 2024?
It's funny, when I started the company, I thought, but the folks at Johns Hopkins, I was doing research at Johns Hopkins, and they asked me if I'd help them with some projects. So this was one of those projects they had been working on since 95, and now it's 2006. And I said, okay, all you want me to do is make an MR compatible catheter. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. That's what I was doing in my career as an electrical engineer. I was helping pacemaker companies make their pacemakers MR compatible. I'm like, okay, sure, we can do that. So we made an MR compatible catheter. I thought we'd sell that to somebody, and they would just launch this whole new field. But the world changed a couple of times around us. A couple of financial crises where venture capital dried up, some changes in strategic acquisition and patterns. So we've just been forced to take it to the next step and take it to the next step and take it to the next step. So now, sometimes unbelievably to me, we're at a point where we don't want to get bought by a big player in this field. We want to be a big player in this field, and we have all the pieces in place. We've done the heavy lifting now. It's ablation catheters, diagnostic catheters, sheaths, transeptal puncture kits, bidirectional, dispersive electrodes, an EP recording system, a stimulator, an RF generator, and a 3D mapping system. I mean, come on, that's everything. So we are ready to go, and now it's just a great time. We have 2 clinical trials, global clinical trials that we're starting, one for VT that you mentioned earlier, and another one for FDA approval, which will open up that huge market in the U.S.
It feels like you've gone from sort of the original conception of basically selling one widget to now really a platform across an industry, which has a hell of a lot more value.
It does.
Value to it than a lower margin business. Siemens is on the register. Can you sort of talk to obviously that background, but also the other sort of collaborations and partnerships that Imricor has as well? Whether it's GE and whatnot.
Siemens is on the register. That was a great support from them. In fact, we have a Siemens MRI in our facility, which is really accelerated. I mean, it has been accelerating for years
Yeah.
now, our progress. And that was part of that investment, actually, was to get that MRI system. But we have great partnerships across all three major MRI manufacturers. That's GE, Siemens, and Philips. Our oldest one's actually with Philips. We've licensed some technology that they invented before I even started the company that we put in our catheters. We've been working with them for years on our first clinical trials and so forth, and continue to do so today. Siemens came in a little bit later, but then engaged in us really robustly, and now we've got a solution on that platform as well. And GE most recently, in fact, GE's paying us to adapt our 3D mapping system and our tracking hardware to the GE platform. And so it's a great thing. The other nice thing about North Star, this is the 3D mapping system, is we've made that an environment that is the center of the whole procedure, the whole lab. So it controls the MRI. No one has to sit at the MRI console. So it's kind of like Apple or an iPhone and an Android, and people don't like changing
Like
between
the
two
operating
of them.
system, yeah.
But so that's what the MR is. But for us and for our customers, North Star is North Star, whether it's a GE scanner, a Philips scanner, or a Siemens scanner.
Agnostic.
And it's really nice, and it gives them, they control it. It gets the images, it does the guidance, everything's taken care of for them the same.
Perhaps you can just try and give us a bit of a background. It almost sounds a little bit too simplistic or too easy. It's been bloody tough work, frankly.
Yeah.
If you could just sort of talk to how you've got to where you are today, particularly with the couple of developments with AF and VT, just the sheer amount of both trials and work, and where we're sort of particularly on VT, where we're at. We've sort of talked in different releases about being at a tipping point, being at one of the most exciting and mature developments of the company. Can you just sort of paint the picture there of all the work? Because you see different companies where it's REA, completely different sort of business, but it was 20 cents for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden it looks like an overnight success. This has been going for almost 30 years sort of thing, but it's been, as we say, very tough work. So if you could just give a bit of a background there, that'd be great.
I come from a musical family, so my dad was on the road playing guitar for Johnny Cash when he was 18 years old. I thought I'd be a musician, my whole life until I went to college. And it's always the same thing with bands. They're an overnight success that's been working hard in the garages for years and years and years. And that's what Imricor is like too. It is it's taken a lot of over 17 years now, right? 2 financial crises and a global pandemic. That's enough. But on top of that, the European regulatory environment has gotten much more difficult as they've gone from what they used to call medical device directives to now the medical device regulation. It's just it's one thing after another, but the team I've got is so motivated, so close, and that you can't peel them away from this project. So there's lots of things I could say that have been headwinds, but we don't really focus on those. We just focus on getting through them, getting past them, and moving on to the next thing. And sometimes it works out in your benefit. The FDA, for instance, right now is just fantastic to work with. They're just so collaborative, so great. Everything's streamlined. We're really looking forward to it.
What do you make that out to in terms of?
I'm not sure. Change of leadership, change of personnel. I think the pandemic did something to show them that there are other ways to do business, remotely and so forth. But I can tell you that they're really a joy to work with. And so,
with all due respect to FDA, it sounds, speaking to other different companies, it's usually a different sort of experience. So it's pleasantly surprising to hear that.
I think maybe 20 years ago I'd have given you a different answer, but you know how these things change, and just like Europe was easy before and it's difficult now, it's the other way around. And a lot of times that follows when regulation gets too stringent, innovation turns off, and now things are available for patients in other countries that good technology that's not available for your own people, and you start to change your mind about what you're doing in that with regard to regulatory.
Before we get onto sort of revenue model and framing that up, if you could just again sort of expand on what's sort of left on VT and how sort of de-risked is it? Obviously we've got the approval on the trials. But if you could just sort of talk us into some detail there.
The trial's approved and ready to go. We have one site that has full approval to start. We're waiting for the first patient. There's discussions there that are taking place to get that going. But we're also opening even better sites. This is the first one that got across the line, but the biggest sites and the ones we're most excited about are higher volume VT centers, like University Medical Center in Amsterdam, and really the Charité, the German Heart Center of the Charité in Berlin, which has Gerd Hendricks heading their EP department, and it's, he's one of the top key opinion leaders in the world.
When you talk about higher procedures, does that mean it's more likely to be actually able to recruit patients as well?
It's just, hospitals, they get people with arrhythmias, but the type of arrhythmia that they see most often seems to be pretty regional. A lot of atrial flutter patients in one region, none of them in a different one, in ventricular tachycardia and so forth. Also, VT tends to go to higher institutions, and our first site, is a great site, but it's not that. It's not the Charité. So, we'll get started, and we'll push through that trial. At the same time, the Hopkins trial, or I should say the FDA trial, is ready to go. We've been at Hopkins, set up, practiced. They're ready to go as soon as they get institutional review board approval.
So what are the sort of catalysts and milestones look like there? Like with success on the VT trials, obviously it's how long do we have to sort of wait in terms of, is it as soon as the procedure's done, it's a tick, is it recovery? What does that sort of look like?
Yeah, for VT it's a 6-month follow-up. For atrial flutter it's actually we do a 3-month follow-up, but we'll submit right after the first case or the last case is finished.
But in terms of once you've recruited patients, and we'll see how it sort of spits out in terms of hopefully the success. But there should be a number of news items and milestones.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Sure, of course. We'll announce when we start the trial, each of them, and then actually throughout the year while the trial's going on, the doctors who are doing these procedures will be on the podium at the Heart Rhythm Society or the European Society of Cardiology or the Society of Cardiovascular Magnetic Resonance or AHA, or on, and they'll be talking about what they're doing and how and why they're doing it, and that's how you really start to gain momentum.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the next questions I asked in terms of how important is that with regards to doctor, physician, sort of support and championship, but B, how hard is it to actually change the doctor behaviours, and even the hospital sort of behaviours to actually adopt these labs?
It's not. It can be hard. There's a lot of times when, doctors will hesitate. They resist the change that new technology brings, and they'll embrace it a little bit later. But before I started this company, when the guys at Hopkins said, "Hey, we're working on interventional MR for ablation procedures because for these reasons," and they had done years of publications and studies to show why you should do this. The only thing they couldn't do is make the catheter that was MR compatible. And I was thinking about whether this was a project I wanted to take on or not. I went to one of the shows. It was the Society for Cardiovascular Magnetic Resonance. It was out in Seattle. And they had one of these sessions where two doctors go up and they debate. Someone says the pro and the other says the con of some item. And they plan ahead of time. And this was interventional MR will be the future of cardiac ablations. The pro guy came up and said all the things that everybody had been talking about. The con guy came up and said, I'm not going to argue about anything that my colleague just said. We all know the benefits of MR for these procedures, and all we need is for somebody out there in the audience from industry to make us the devices we need to be able to do these procedures, and then we can move on. And I took that as a good sign, and that's what we find today as well, is that there's a good, strong market pull for this. It's a not a simple thing. I can't give them a catheter and they can just work it into their normal workflow. They have to have the MR lab first. So it takes a little bit more time. But again, it's sticky once that happens.
And I suppose once you have, sort of, whether it's a key opinion leader or, a strong advocate that's completed these procedures before and then you've got the successful patient outcomes, it becomes a pretty powerful.
It does. It's important to have these key opinion leaders talking about what you're doing. You can do, there's lots of devices I can think of where they engage, a bunch of little smaller hospitals. They did some things, but they just never got traction.
Yeah.
And you need somebody saying, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. And it's we've got the best in the world. If you look at the hospitals we're at, the Charité, the German Heart Center of the Charité, the SHU, the Lausanne University Medical Center, Johns Hopkins University, you're going to find all these in the top 5-6 hospitals in the world. And it's across the board for the doctors we're working with.
Now, again, it's been a tough period in terms of things taking longer and COVID and all the rest of it. And obviously bonds, the way that they are, the markets are pretty tough. And funding a basically sort of pre-revenue company is not an easy task.
Yeah.
Companies just recently completed the capital raising. We spoke to the potential opportunity in North Dakota with regards to additional funding there. If you could just, obviously could be a significant positive and a lot of breathing room. If you could just sort of talk to that opportunity and what that looks like.
Sure. I mean, first, it's been, of course, a frustrating time coming out of the pandemic. We leaned into it. We had a lot of money on the balance sheet. We spent that money doing what we told people we were going to do at the time we did our IPO. That seemed like a good idea, but the way things changed after the pandemic, suddenly, maybe in retrospect,
hindsight's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, we should have hibernated a bit. But I'm happy where we are right now and glad that we're moving forward. But it meant that we had to go and look for alternate ways of financing the business. So our nearby state of North Dakota is looking to grow medtech industry there, and they have some economic development incentives that are drawing us to advance or expand our manufacturing capacity into there. We're not moving the company necessarily. We're just expanding in Fargo, North Dakota, rather than in Minneapolis, and that has opened up the door for other North Dakota investment funds to take a look at us. And one of those is the Pioneer Capital Fund. The legislature in North Dakota set aside $600 million for other funds then to get pieces of and invest for these purposes. And Pioneer Capital Fund is one of those funds. And we have a letter of intent from them to invest $8 million at 60 cents US, so 95 to $1 Aussie. And that is something we expect that will happen in the next several months.
That'll be a fantastic outcome. Just in terms of, obviously, again, not talking all doom and gloom, but what do you sort of still see, besides sort of funding and that sort of stuff, what do you see as the sort of key risks still outstanding?
I'll be honest with you, Simon, it's the funding is the only risk we've got. So I got to be careful what I say. I feel that that is the only. And when you have a catheter that treats atrial flutter, and it does it with 100% chronic effectiveness in our clinical trial, and that device senses electrical activity, it burns the tissue when it needs to, it can pace, it's got tip temperature sensing, and it can move around the heart. That's what it needs to do to cure atrial flutter. That's what it needs to do to cure ventricular tachycardia or atrial fibrillation. It's a tool, right? If it does it for one, it's going to do it for the others. The trick now is to just use MR imaging to make the procedure even better than it would be if you were just doing that same thing in X-ray. So I feel so much of this risk is gone. Now there's also regulatory risk and development risk, but that's what we put the development risk behind us during the pandemic. We have the same value proposition we had in 2019, except we've taken all this development risk out. We have 5 or 6 new devices that are ready now, so we can take on every ablation procedure, not just atrial flutter. And then regulatory risk is, it's part of the job when you work in medical devices. But again, like I say, especially in the U.S., it's really a great time to be bringing stuff to market.
So just coming back to why it's such an exciting time for the company and VT trials and starting that and what that means, if you could just perhaps frame up the difference again, or why it's fundamentally such an exciting time for the company to be going into VT trials and how much bigger that is than the AF market or the push and pull between the doctors.
Yeah, so we start with atrial flutter.
Yep.
Then the next two are atrial fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia. Atrial flutter is already a pretty successful X-ray procedure. It's pretty fast and easy to do. What we can say about atrial flutter, it's where you start. Whenever you have a new device, you start with the one that's easy, right, and then you move on. But we can do the same procedure in the same time with the same or better effectiveness. Actually, truth is, our time showed to be about half the time that it took them to do it in conventional labs as well. But we'll just say same procedure, same time, same cost, same effectiveness, all the same, in a radiation-free setting. So it's not the worst thing in the world. But that's not what gets people to buy a brand new MRI lab just to do atrial flutter, sort of the same way they can do it already.
Yeah.
Where MR is going to add value, we believe, is in atrial fibrillation and ventricular tachycardia for lots of great reasons that have been published for decades now. And so it's important that we show everybody in the world that we're moving beyond atrial flutter now, after COVID's over, and that we're doing the complex ablations and really fulfilling the what MR-guided interventions was all supposed to be about in the first place. What's really interesting about it is, in Europe, it makes a lot of sense monetarily as well, because you don't make much money on an atrial flutter case. The reimbursement's lower.
Yeah, makes sense.
Ventricular tachycardia, you get the most. In the U.S., you get 5 to 6 times as much money to do any one of the procedures. What it means, you get the same reimbursement whether you're doing atrial flutter in a half-hour procedure or a 6-hour ventricular tachycardia ablation. So in the U.S., getting over $20,000 as opposed to like $3,000 to $5,000 in Germany. In the U.S., you get the same amount if you're doing a half-hour procedure or a 6-hour procedure. So where's your motivation? It's to do a bunch of these atrial flutter ablations. And of course, that's where we'll start. So that's why getting started in the U.S. is a big catalyst. We get to create real revenue very quickly in that market.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the ones that I sort of wanted to finish on is probably you more so personally in terms of drive and motivation. How do you, again, it's COVID and particular company that's access to hospitals was a complete shit fight and whatnot. How do you sort of are you still as motivated as you was when you first became involved with the company? You're more motivated. Obviously patient outcomes is such a critical benefit of Imricor's vision. How do you sort of look at that?
Yeah, we talk a lot about heavy lifting, and we've done a lot of heavy lifting, and it beats you down after a while. It seems like just everything's fighting you, and you want to get something meaningful done. But when I started this, I wanted to do something substantial with my career. I just, I was late 30s and felt like I could just conquer the world, and this is the way I was going to do it. I still feel like that, and this is a once-in-a-lifetime type of technology that we're working at. It's one of the reasons why, despite how hard it's been, even for the whole team, and the fact that almost every one of my employees could go find a better paying job somewhere else, the job market's like that right now. They all stick around because this is special, what we're doing. And now it's getting fun again. COVID was hard. After COVID hangover was also hard. Now it's getting fun again with 2 trials that are approved. We see the workings in the hospitals to get patient enrollment started. We see sites that had signed with us before in Europe before the pandemic, but hadn't yet started doing cases, are becoming we call activated, meaning we're installing our equipment and they're starting to do procedures. I don't know that this quarter is going to be a big inflection point for those procedures, but starting first quarter for sure, we'll start to see more patient volume go through. And so on all fronts, it's a really exciting time, and it's like I said, getting fun again.
It's funny when you talk about quarter by quarter, when you've had this journey that's gone basically for decades. It doesn't really matter about one quarter.
It doesn't,
and that's where in terms of the success, touch wood on the VT trials and FDA approval. It's such a critical milestone year in 2024 to come. So let's hope the momentum continues, and best of luck into 2024. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Cheers.